welcome everyone. We're obviously very happy to have you here tonight to talk about answering the call and addressing barriers to women's mobile inclusion and mobile engagement. And as Samir said, I am the India Research Director for Evidence for Policy Design. For those of you who don't know us, we call ourselves EPOD, and of course, which is our acronym. We're based at Harvard's Kennedy School, and we're a network of researchers, practitioners, staff, and students at Harvard and around the world that work closely with public and private sector partners to identify problems, pressing policy challenges, and then generate rigorous research around that to address these problems with real implementable solutions. So very glad to be here. Before I start talking about some of the research that we've done, I just want to raise the issue of India and women and gaps. I don't know about you, but when you start thinking about India's women, it's not very long into that process that we start thinking about the various gender-focused gaps that pop up. So some are positive, we have positive news on them, such as the educational gap. That seems to be closing, the gender gap in education. But most of them are overwhelmingly negative statistics that we cite about India. And I think many of you saw recent press from the World Economic Forum. This was in the news quite broadly, where India has recently sank in their gender equality index from number 87 to, I think, 112, something like that, in the rankings. Sorry, 121, or they slid 21 places in the rankings on their gender equality index. And most of this comes down to the fact that India's women are faring quite poorly on economic indicators, economic opportunity, and then also health-related indicators like survival and these types of things. So given that India is doing so poorly in some of these areas when it comes to specific gender gaps, I'd like to pose the question for you as to why is it that we need to talk about yet one more gap that we should be paying attention to? And when there are limited resources, people have limited time to pay attention to different gaps, why is it that we should focus on yet one more gap? We're talking about policy priorities. Should we try to address the mobile gap as a gap in and of itself that's important? So why might mobile as a policy goal in itself actually matter? I think some of these answers would be obvious, right? One is that the government is very focused on DBT as a means of service delivery, and along with that, not just DBT, but DBT enabled through the JAM platform. And so this assumes that individuals have access to mobile and can actually engage with the government in that fashion using their mobile phones. And of course, mobile itself is pervading the economy, rapidly changing things. And I think the way that we can think about this quite easily is if I said, you cannot leave the room until you give me your mobile phone, and you can't have a mobile phone for the rest of the year or something like that, you would quite quickly begin to feel the pain of not having your phone with you anymore. I know recently I heard that my email on my mobile phone was potentially not going to work, and I can't tell you how anxious I suddenly felt that I wasn't going to be able to address emails quickly and that sort of thing. And of course, we're all thinking about mobile as checking weather, checking news, talking with friends, chatting, this type of thing. But for someone for whom mobile is the only way that they can interact with the information economy, with the internet, this type of thing, taking away a mobile phone from them or not giving someone mobile access is quite a big deal, right? If you don't have a laptop or a desktop at home, but you do have a mobile phone and you can connect to data into the internet, taking that away or actually giving someone access to that opportunity when they haven't had that before can be quite transformative. And we also know that mobile itself, from what the research has shown, is actually it does have transformative impacts on people. So there have been different studies that show that mobile phones help to close price dispersion for individuals that are trying to get the best price for whatever type of output that they have. So it actually has changed the economy by helping people go straight to the sellers or the buyers of their products. Other things that mobile has done that we know about have been to through apps and SMS messaging, help to change behavior in positive ways, whether it's thinking about health-related outcomes, education-related outcomes, or finance-related behaviors. All these things are very important, and mobile has the potential to change them and influence them in a positive way. And of course, I think many of us saw recent results tied to mobile money in Kenya, and this mobile money that's rolled out in Kenya has been extremely popular, and it has helped poor households deal with risks, deal with vulnerabilities and potential shocks, negative shocks. But more than that, it's helped poor households come out of poverty. 2% of Kenyan households came out of poverty as a result of mobile money coming into the system. And it's helped women in particular. But the research itself, when we think about gender and how women tie into this, is really, really limited. I'm going to talk about the results of the research that we've done over the past few months, but just want to highlight that part of what we did was a literature review and looking at different papers tied to mobile and mobile engagement and the impact of mobile. Females are, in gender itself, is something that's relatively silent in the literature. It's just not something that's looked into well. Only 18% of the papers that we looked at actually said something about gender or tried to look at things by gender. And finally, to the extent that barriers for women in India might be quite strong, might be quite binding for them, maybe they're sitting at home and cannot leave their homes, then we think that mobile itself could be even more powerful, right? So if you're sitting at home and you can't go anywhere, the fact that with a phone you can now have information about jobs, you can meet people or network, you can learn information about the world is quite an amazing thing. These women previously wouldn't have access to this type of information. So we do think that the benefits of mobile could be disproportionately higher when you're thinking about women. So all these things are very important things to think about, and at least raise the possibility that, yes, the gender gap in mobile ownership and mobile engagement is potentially an area that we should be looking at as a policy priority. We should take it very seriously and treat it as a goal that we should be working towards to increase women's mobile engagement. So with all that, I want to talk with you a little bit about some of the research that we've done. With a team of researchers here, we have Rohini Pandey, who's from Harvard Kennedy School. She's one of our principal investigators. I'm also a principal investigator on the project. And then we have Simone Shaner from the University of Southern California. She's back in the back waving her hands. Erica Field from Duke University, if you want to wave, there. And then Georgia Barboni, who's at Princeton right now. We had another colleague from Harvard who's not able to be here, Natalia Riegel. But all that I'm showing you is a result of the work that our team and then also dedicated staff of fellows and various people both at Harvard and other universities and also in India have been working on for the past few months. And all this was commissioned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who've been quite lovely in being supportive of addressing these issues and wanting to really look into them. But before we actually go into all the results from the research, I just want to point out that India's gender gap in mobile is actually extremely high. So these bars right here are representing some of the countries with the highest gender gap in mobile ownership, and you see South Asia in particular really sticks out from this group. So the other countries are other ones that have quite high mobile gender gaps. Most countries are much, much lower than that. And they show the percentage point gap in female ownership versus male ownership. So India's ownership gap overall is 35%, and then their access gap is smaller, but it's 18%. And before I go any further, what I would like you all to do is an exercise with mobile phones with me. So I hope all of you are here with a phone and you have mobile data installed on your phone. And what I would like you to do is navigate to www.pollev.com/EPOD. And I'll give you just a second to do that. And then once you do that, I'm going to have you answer a question. We'll have a live poll going on, and I'm going to ask you what you think the biggest barrier to women's mobile engagement is. And then your answers will pop up as a word cloud. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to this poll. So what are the biggest barriers to women's mobile engagement in India? You can answer as many times as you'd like, and the words that are used more frequently, of course, will pop up on the screen more in larger letters, larger font. And this is very interesting for us because we also presented these results earlier today and asked the very same questions. So it's interesting to see what ends up coming up in the different groups that we're speaking with about this research. So as you continue answer, you can do that. It will continue to fill, but it looks to be that there is some consensus around social norms driving women's lack of mobile engagement. See some really interesting responses to safety, attitudes, control, patriarchy, awareness, literacy, digital literacy, relevant content. Yeah, very, very interesting. Thank you. Women needs morality. Yeah, very good. So I'm going to go ahead and move on, and I think I'd love to ask you about some of these responses, but I think we'll get to that in the Q&A. I don't want to take up too much of the time because I know you're here for the panel and probably not just to hear me speak. But yeah, one key takeaway, of course, is that norms are very important. So it's interesting to see that, you know, basically your prior on this is that norms dominate the landscape. And actually, interestingly enough, that's what we found this morning from the other group that we ran this poll with, who are a group who work kind of in a variety of different sectors, but we're interested in the research that we were doing as well. So the research that was commissioned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has basically given us the mandate both to understand the barriers to women's mobile engagement, to map that gap and to understand it a little bit better. And then moving on, we're going to be working on some different projects to try to actually address this gap. So I'm showing you the results of the first 4 to 5 months of the research. And basically it was during this time that we did a landscaping, a literature review. We did qualitative field work. So you can see up here on the standee that we spoke with we spoke with 125 people, 98 women in that group, in 5 different states and territories to understand what are their perspectives on mobile. And then we also did quantitative analysis, and I'll talk just a little bit about that so you have a sense of what that entailed and what we learned from it. The first thing, though, that I want to point out to you that is interesting is that, and this is something that I think, you know, came through in what you were putting on the slides, is that India has a high ownership gender gap in mobile in spite of their income level, in spite of your income level, and also in spite of the cost of mobile here. So right here I have a graph that's showing the cost of mobile on the x-axis and then the ownership gap on the y-axis. So a higher number on the y-axis would mean there's more gender disparity in mobile phone ownership. And what you'll see is that there's a positive relationship between the cost of mobile and that ownership gap, which is not too surprising. But the thing that is a little bit surprising is that India and then Bangladesh and Pakistan, so South Asia in particular, are basically off whatever type of, you know, if you wanted to draw a line, a regression line through these different coordinates. So India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan seem to have a higher ownership gap for men and women despite the cost of mobile. And of course, India's income levels are much higher than a lot of the different countries that I had on this, the first graph that was showing, you know, I think it was Burkina Faso, make sure I say this correctly, or sorry, yeah, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda has a higher gap, but some of these countries that have lower gaps than India definitely have lower income. So it's not that this is entirely an income issue as well, or necessarily. And the other thing that we see when we look at a gender inequality index, so on the right-hand side of, or sorry, on the x-axis of this graph here, we have gender inequality plotted against the ownership gap once again. So here again, a higher number means there's a higher gender disparity in mobile ownership. And we see once again that there's a positive relationship between gender inequality and this mobile gap. But of course that India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, once again, are outliers in this situation. So even though there is a correlation between this gender inequality, they still are off the chart in some ways and raise questions as to why it is that India's women are not more engaged with mobile. And one other thing that's important to think about is how does this look across India? Of course, there are huge variations throughout the country, and we see that there are places with more equitable mobile engagement, mobile ownership and access, and then also less equitable. So the least equitable states are Haryana and Rajasthan. And this makes sense, I think, when we're thinking about norms, right? The most equitable, interestingly enough, are Chhattisgarh and Kerala. And someone was pointing out to me today, Chhattisgarh's or more equitable levels are not due to the fact that no one has mobile phones. Women actually have more, or a higher percentage of women have mobile phones in Chhattisgarh than, say, in Madhya Pradesh or Orissa, Jharkhand, so states nearby, and men have actually quite low ownership rates. So there are differences that are interesting to explore and to try to understand a little bit better why that might be. And one more thing I want to point out before I share any more on the statistics is that there are a lot of different data sources, or I shouldn't say a lot, there are some different data sources that try to talk about women in mobile ownership, but what they show can vary quite drastically depending on how the question is actually asked related to women and their mobile engagement. So when we look at the Gallup World Poll, 73% of women say that they have a mobile phone that they can use to make and receive personal calls. This is obviously different than just having a mobile phone. The National Family Health Survey, the statistic there is only that 45.9% of women say that they actually have any mobile phone that they themselves actually use. So less than 50% of women are saying that there's a phone that they actually do use. In the Pew Global Attitude Survey, a much smaller sample, but this is women 18 and older, just under 2/3 say that they owned a cell phone. But in the Financial Inclusions Insights Survey, which has a much larger sample size and is trying to get at mobile engagement throughout the country, this talks to women age 15 and older, they asked, do you personally own a mobile phone? And by personally, I mean that you use it the most and control how to use this phone. Only 1/3 of women said yes to this answer to this question. And that's the number that we've been looking at as the women's ownership number, because these women say that they actually do own and control the phone. And one other thing to point out about the gap is that the gaps in India exist across the spectrum of access. So what I'm showing you right here, you should look at this. The higher the number is here, the gender gap is actually increasing. This is the female ownership standardized, or the gap standardized by the proportion of males that actually own or do these things. So when we talk about any access at all, the ownership or the gap is 14%. When we get down to things like owning a phone, it's 46% here. And just remember, this is a different metric than just absolute rates of the gender gap in ownership. And to SMS, it's slightly larger at 51%. But the gender gap appears to be increasing in what we would consider, or many of us would consider, potentially higher value activities that you could do on your phone. So once you start getting into data and these types of things, the gender gap is quite large. Women aren't owning smartphones, they aren't using social media, they aren't doing financial transactions, working on the internet, or using any other apps. So this is quite striking to see that kind of these more engaged activities on mobile, the gap is much, much higher for them. So I want to share with you a little bit related to the qualitative work that we did. And I think this was really useful for us to understand a little bit more related to the norms in particular. But when we combine the qualitative and the quantitative work, we look together and we see that both economic and normative constraints matter. So in statistical parlance, we looked at some data from the IHDS, the Indian Human Development Survey, and controlled for different factors and regressions related to women's mobile ownership within the household, and looked at things like income and education, where someone actually lives, and then what we would call an empowerment proxy or a norms proxy tied to women's empowerment. And we see that income, education, assets, and empowerment all matter for whether a woman actually controls a phone in a house, that a man also has a phone. So all these things actually matter. It's not that just norms matter. I think this is an important takeaway from the research that we've done, but norms are very, very important to women's mobile engagement. So now I want to walk through a little bit what we found from this qualitative work. Oops, sorry. Oh, hope I didn't freeze it. So the first thing we learned from our qualitative research around the country was that mobile phones pose a threat to a woman's reputation. And what does this mean? I think this came up a bit in this word cloud. And it's that mobile phones can pose a threat to a woman's chastity or to a woman's purity. And this is a major issue, particularly for women that are not yet married, right? So this woman can pose a risk to herself by accidentally or purposefully getting into a situation that would eventually cause dishonor to the family. And that's a very important issue here. And in fact, what we do see is that the gender gap emerges as girls approach marriage. So this is the last graph I'm going to show you. This is from the IHDS. So this is old data, relatively old data, but we still learn something about it. So we have here on this dotted line the proportion of females in the sample that were ever married. So obviously it starts increasing right around the year 15. It starts increasing drastically and gets to basically 100% of women. And we see here in the blue line the share of men who actually, or males I should say, who use mobile phones. And then in the red line, the share of females who said that they use mobile phones. And you'll see that from the youngest age that this question is asked, at age 10, to approximately age 14 or maybe 15, there's not really a very large gender gap in male and female mobile usage. Once girls hit this age that marriage starts being, a priority in their lives and they're a little bit older, they drop off. They don't have any increases in mobile use, and then the males continue to climb here. Now, this is cross-sectional data. I mean, we're just looking at one group that was surveyed at one point in time, so it can't tell us everything we want to know, but I think the trends that we see here are really indicative. Women's mobile use doesn't increase once they hit, what we would puberty or late puberty are being considered to go onto the marriage market. So this is quite striking. Another thing that we found from our qualitative work is that for married women, caregiving takes a precedence over phone use. What does that mean? It means that I'm busy, I'm a mother, or I'm a housewife, I'm taking care of my family. I don't have time to be engaged in frivolous activities like talking on the phone or looking up things on my phone. I should instead be occupied with, kind of higher order duties, that type of thing. So this is something that came out quite clearly, and we talked with many married older women that said there's no reason for me to actually be using a mobile phone. And I think that this also gets to the point that some of the barriers that we already talk about, like the barrier in female labor force participation and the mobile gap, are ones that are interlinked, right? So if I'm a woman who's staying at home and I'm taking care of my family, I have many fewer reasons to actually use a mobile phone than someone who needs to go out and about, either has a job or has customers or clients, that sort of thing, where a phone would be very important for economic purposes as well. So these underlying causes are these different gaps are interlinked in many ways. And this is the final point that I want to make too, is that these normative and economic barriers then end up intersecting, right? So if a household is constrained in the income that they have, and the woman is sitting at home, whether anyone thinks anything about how she should be the second or the last person to get the phone, if the household can only own one phone, you would give it to the income earner, or you just give it to the man, right? And so we often found that women would end up taking phones from household members who had finished using them. Maybe they've gotten the new model, so many of the phones that the women actually had were older, not in as good of shape, these types of things. So these economic and normative barriers intersect in really interesting ways that we need to be thinking about when we're targeting different policies, programs, and interventions to actually close this mobile gender gap. So moving ahead, this is what we would like to do, is not only understand the barriers, but understand how we can actually address them. And I think one of the key questions that we have is, once you actually address these barriers, can mobile in itself help close some of the other gender gaps that we're seeing? Can it help close some of the gaps in health and survival? Can it actually help close some of the gaps related to economic opportunities and labor force participation, these types of things? And that, to me, is where the really exciting work comes in. Can mobile be as transformative or more transformative for women than even it has been so far? So at that, I'm going to invite Barca and our panel to come up. And I think we'll have a really interesting session with them and have some time for Q&A as well. So I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.